Hey everybody, it's just about 1 o'clock here, so we're going to get started. Thanks for being with us today. I'm Jenny Novak. This is the third webinar of 2026. I'm the marketing manager here and I coordinate the webinars. Welcome back if you've been with us for other webinars before. If this is your first one. We have some Antifreeze information for you today. Just a quick intro about us. We are an independent testing laboratory. We've been doing firefighting foam for over 25 years. We also test dry chemical agents, sprinklers, and antifreeze, which we'll be talking about today. And if you've been up on our communications in June, we also announced that we are adding or just added corrosion and MIC testing, diesel fuel, and water mist nozzles. If you're interested in any of those services, they also come along with our free sample kits and shipping in the contiguous US, just like the rest of our antifreeze and other tests do. So take advantage of those if that's something that you're doing out there for your customers or out in the field. Our October webinar is actually going to be on corrosion and MIC testing. So if you're interested in that, we're going to have that webinar in October on the 14th, and there'll be a link to that. Sign up for that webinar in my follow-up email about today. 2 years ago, we were acquired by NFPA Global Solutions, and we've continued to provide the same fast and reliable service with quality test results and expand our testing services, as I just talked about. We're also always asked if we're certified or accredited. ISO certified 9001, and we're also 17025 accredited by A2LA for our automatic field sprinkler testing. I think we also are in the process of, or just recently acquired the same 17025 for diesel fuel. We'll be having announcements about that soon. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them into the chat window there, or if you're into the Q&A window, we usually save them up. Have a little session at the end. We'll go back and forth on those, but go ahead and type them in as you're thinking of them, so we can get to those at the end. If you stay until the end of the webinar, we will send you a certificate of attendance. People have asked about credits for those. People are using them for NICET credits, is my understanding. We're a NICET partner in training, and we're also newly an ICC preferred education provider, and those logos will be on that certificate of attendance. I automatically send them to people that were registered and stayed through, but if you don't see one in the next couple of days, feel free to email me and reach out. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll also receive a link to the video that's published on our YouTube channel. Today's webinar, Antifreeze Solution Testing, will be presented by Alyssa. She's our general manager at Dyne and has been in several roles over the last 7 or so years and oversees our daily operations. Now I'd like to turn it over to Alyssa to talk to us about antifreeze testing.
Jenny for the introduction. We'll go ahead and get started on antifreeze solution testing. So here's my information. If you don't get your questions answered live on the webinar, or if you have questions that come up later, feel free to contact me directly. There's my email and my direct line as well. Just a quick disclaimer, any opinion expressed in this presentation is that of my own and does not necessarily represent the official position of NFPA or its technical committees. All right, so antifreeze testing requirements. This is going to come from the newest edition of NFPA 25. We always reference the newest edition with our testing requirements. So NFPA 2026 edition, we're looking at section 534, and that's where the antifreeze testing requirements come from. So how often are we supposed to be testing antifreeze? The standard says annually, before the onset of freezing conditions at the beginning of the heating season. So before it gets cold and we turn on our heaters is when we should be checking the antifreeze. Why are we doing that? Well, as over time, the antifreeze can settle out of solution. You could have areas where the concentration is too low, and this is where you're not protected at the appropriate freeze point. So you could have pipes that freeze, which could lead to burst pipes and obviously disaster in your system, as well as concentration points where the concentration is too high. So if antifreeze is settling, at the bottom of the system, you could have points where you have a high concentration of antifreeze, at which point it becomes an ignition risk, where your antifreeze could actually accelerate the fire rather than extinguish it. And then another reason to test is for determining the type of antifreeze. If you have the improper type in your system, you could run into compatibility issues, or if you've mixed antifreezes for some reason, that could also lead to issues as well. So that's why we're testing. We want to do that annually before freezing conditions onset annually. So before sampling, you do want to determine the type of antifreeze that you have in your system. And you can do this in a number of ways. Ideally, you have an information sign on your system that tells you what type of antifreeze you have, the concentration, the volume, and all that. That is a requirement. You could have installation records on hand, maintenance records, information from the building owner, or other reliable information that will tell you what type of antifreeze you have in your system. If you don't know, you can do a chemical or laboratory test. You could send it to a lab like Dyne, and we could determine the type of antifreeze that you have in your system. But that is the first step. So if you've determined the type in your system, and either A, the type is no longer permitted, or B, it cannot be determined, that at that point you would need to drain your system and refill with an acceptable solution. So if you're not sure, you can send it to a lab to determine the type, but if you already know it's no longer permitted, that you have an ethylene glycol in your system, that type's no longer permitted, so you'd need to drain and refill with an acceptable solution. Or it's too diluted and cannot be determined, you'd also need to drain and refill with an acceptable solution. And in most cases, this is going to be a listed solution. We'll go over the permitted types of antifreeze, but in most cases, you would be refilling with a listed solution. So again, we'll talk about now the types of antifreeze that are permitted. So there are two different types that are permitted. If you have a existing system, you can still have legacy solutions installed in that system. And so legacy solutions are glycerin solutions or propylene glycol. For glycerin, you can have up to 38% by volume concentration, and propylene glycol is up to 30% by volume. The one exception there is if you have ESFR sprinklers that are listed for greater than 30% by volume propylene glycol, those are permitted if they're listed for such an application. Otherwise, it's 30% for propylene glycol and 38% for glycerin. You cannot refill a system with legacy solution, and you cannot install a new system with legacy solution. You're just permitted to keep this in service if you already have it. So the other permitted type is listed solutions. So there are 4 listed products on the market. So I have them listed here: Tyco LFP Plus, the Noble Firefighter Eliminator 1330, as well as Lubrizol Freeze Master. So those are the only 4 listed products on the market that I am aware of. I thought it would be fun to go over a history of how the permitted types have changed in the last several editions of NFPA 25. So back in 2008, it was kind of the wild, wild west, so to speak. Solutions could be mixed in the field. The NFPA 2008 standard had a chart that you could mix up all 4 of these different types of antifreeze solutions in the field. So you would do 70% by volume glycerin and 30% water, and same for the remaining types. Mix it up in the field and install it in the system. I don't even believe there was any testing requirements for antifreeze. So it was a very short section, not a whole lot of requirements. In 2009, though, there was an incident that changed the standard. There was a 2009 apartment kitchen fire where sprinkler activated and a high concentration of antifreeze came out of the sprinkler, which led to an explosion. So there was 1 dead and 4 injured in that incident, which led to a series of investigations and research to figure out the cause of that, and it led to some drastic changes in the standard. So in 2011, they said no more mixing antifreeze solutions out in the field. If you introduce legacy solutions into your system, it has to be factory premixed. The reason for that is antifreeze does not like to mix with water. It doesn't mix very well, so it needs to be done in a factory and not necessarily, in the field. They removed the diethylene glycol or ethylene glycol as options for antifreeze types. You could no longer have those types in your system. And they did say all systems shall utilize listed antifreeze products with some exceptions. This was introduced in the 2011 version, but the first listed antifreeze product was not listed until 2018. So for a few years, the industry had to catch up, release listed products, and get those out to the industry. So if you had a system that was installed prior to September 30th, 2012, you could keep legacy solutions in service until September 30th, 2022. And they allowed, similar to the current requirements, propylene glycol up to 30% and glycerin up to 38%, but there was an option to do an additional risk assessment that would allow for higher concentrations. So you could have up to 40% propylene glycol with a risk assessment and up to 50% glycerin with a risk assessment. And so that was the 2011, 2014, 2017, and 2020 editions. In the 2023 edition, they removed that sunset date. So now you could keep your legacy solutions in service beyond that September 30th, 2022 deadline, provided that they meet these volume requirements. So they did remove the requirement that you could have higher concentrations with a risk assessment. It's now capped at 38 and 30% by volume for those two types. And then again, listed solutions, those four on the market right there. And this is the same as the 2026 edition. There was very little changes between 2023 and 2026 besides some wording, but otherwise the general requirements are the same. Again, legacy solutions and existing systems only. And if you drain it for any reason, you got to refill with an acceptable solution, which is a listed product in most cases. So after you have determined the type of antifreeze you have in your system, whether that be from information or through laboratory tests, you would sample your antifreeze for your annual testing, and they should take samples from the following locations. So we need a top and bottom sample, as well as a most remote and water supply sample, if not already accounted for in the top or bottom sample sets. And then if you do have a larger system, so if you have a system greater than 150 gallons, you would need an additional sample for every 100 gallons beyond that. And that's, the various sample points are there just because the antifreeze can settle out of solution, or you have various points of contamination. So you want to make sure that it is appropriate at all points in the system and at least get a representative look at the system as a whole. The one caveat is that the listed product manufacturer could specify the number of test points slightly differently. The standard does allow for the manufacturer specifications above these top, bottom, most remote water supplies requirements. And then they also would dictate the refilling procedure for the listed products as well. So after you've tested or taken your samples for testing, the testing itself consists of checking the specific gravity or density or the refractive index. So specific gravity you would do with a hydrometer with a suitable scale. And then the refractive index, you would use a refractometer that's calibrated for the specific antifreeze type. And this testing can be done in the field or by a laboratory. If you're doing this testing in the field, you do need to know what type of antifreeze you have, because you would need to reference a scale for your type of antifreeze to determine the percent concentration and freeze point, as well as refractometers are typically calibrated for a specific type of antifreeze. So you have a refractometer calibrated for glycerin, and it would tell you the percent concentration and freeze point for that type of antifreeze. If you use it with a different product, like a propylene glycol or even a listed product, it's not going to give you an accurate result. So that's the one caveat with field testing, is you do need to know the type of antifreeze you have. So if you don't know, or if you just don't want the liability of the field test, you can certainly send it to a laboratory for testing. And Dyne does this testing on site as well. So we do provide free kits, as Jenny mentioned. It kind of looks like this picture here, 2 bottles for your top and bottom samples. We do results in 5 business days, free shipping as well if within the contiguous US. And then we can also do a listed antifreeze verification test. So if you don't know what type of antifreeze you have, we can determine the type. And if you think it could potentially be a listed product, you could add on a listed verification test, and we can actually look at the chemical composition of the antifreeze and determine if you do have a listed product or not. So what are the testing requirements? So you're going to check the specific gravity or density or the refractive index. And if any of the samples fall outside of the allowable range, the system should be drained and refilled with a listed solution. Again, there are some exceptions that would apply. For example, the CSFR sprinklers can have a greater than 30% by volume propylene glycol solution, and that would be an exception to this requirement. What is the allowable range? So for legacy solutions, again, it's going to be those magic percent by volume requirements, so less than 38% by volume for glycerin and less than 30% by volume for propylene glycol. You would reference a chart like this one found in the annex of NFPA 25, so A53442 of NFPA 25, and it's going to tell you the percent by volume if you are looking at the specific gravity. So if you take the specific gravity, then you can reference this chart, figure out the percent by volume, and it will also tell you the freeze point in Fahrenheit and Celsius. So if you're over 30% by volume for propylene glycol, you would need to drain and refill, but also if you are not meeting the freeze point requirements for your environment. So if it's too diluted and it's no longer sufficient for the environment you're in, you would need to drain and refill at that point as well. So the difference here with the legacy solutions is that the percent concentration also dictates the freeze point. So if you have a 20% by volume, you can calculate what the freeze point would be based on this chart. The listed products operate a little bit differently. So what is the allowable range for listed products? That is going to come directly from the product data sheet. So the manufacturer has a data sheet that will provide the allowable specific gravity and or refractive index ranges. And so you would measure these and compare that to the product data sheet. And so if the solution falls outside of those ranges, then you would be required to drain and refill at that point. And the difference here as well is that it's basically 100% concentration of listed product, or it's less than that. And if it's less than that, you can't exactly determine the freeze point. You can't calculate it based on the data sheet. It's either at the listed concentration, which equals the freeze point dictated on the data sheet, or it's not. So that's a little bit different compared to the legacy solution. So then, in summary, so if you have your looking at your data sheet here or your information tag, you would determine the type of antifreeze that you have in your system. So if you know you have a allowable type, or you're going to send to a laboratory to determine the allowable type, then you would take your sample points from your top, bottom, here we'll go back, top, bottom, most remote, and water supplies. And again, additional test points would be needed if you have a larger system. To review that, take your sample. And if you already know that it's no longer allowed, so if you have a diethylene glycol for some reason, an ethylene glycol, or a high concentration of a legacy solution, you wouldn't necessarily need to test at that point. You would just need to drain and replace at that point. So if you know that it's allowed or you think it might be, then you would sample at that point. You would test the samples, refractive index, or specific gravity. Compare it to either the chart in the annex of NFPA 25. So again, table A53442. You would compare it to that chart and determine the percent concentration as well as the freeze point. Make sure that it's less than the percent by volume for those propylene glycol and glycerin types, as well as that it meets the freeze point requirements for the environment that you're in. And then if they are within the allowable, if they're not within the allowable range, then you would be required to replace. If they are, then you're good to go for another year and you can test again on the annual cycle. So that is the process for antifreeze testing. Some common reasons for failure. So again, it's speaking directly for our laboratory. If we get an antifreeze that is no longer allowed, so if we get an ethylene glycol or something that we can't determine the type for, those would be no longer allowed and that would fail. And you'd be required to drain and replace at that point. We also get samples where the concentration is too low and the type cannot be determined, so it's too diluted. And that could be that there's water introduced into the system, or it's settled out of solution and maybe the top portion is too diluted, or the percent concentration is too high. Again, possibly due to improper mixing. Theoretically, there shouldn't be any field mixed solutions still out there. They are, and they've been out there for quite a long time. But yeah, improper mixing, or again, previously allowed higher concentrations of premixed solutions, like you could have a 48% by volume glycerin solution in your system, so that was previously allowed in the older editions of NFPA 25. Or you have settling of solution. So again, the concentration, the antifreeze has settled out of solution, and that bottom sample is now at a much higher concentration than the top sample. And then at that point, you would be required to drain and refill with a acceptable solution. Or the listed solution is outside of the manufacturer's specified ranges. So the listed solutions are a little bit different, like I said. So the ranges for the specific gravity and the density are very tight. So if you have any contamination of water, or if there's leftover antifreeze in there from draining the system, and that contaminates the listed product, that could push the specific gravity and refractive indexes ranges outside of the data sheet. And then you would be required to drain and refill at that point as well. So those are the top reasons for failure. We can go ahead and answer some of the questions that are floating in the chat. Kenny, do you have questions?
Yeah, let me go back to the top. Came from David in Middle Tennessee, a freeze point, pass or fail criteria.
Freeze point, pass, fail criteria. So if you freeze point, pass, fail criteria. So you would have to determine what the freeze point would be needed for your system. So if you'd look at the historical temperature climate ranges and determine what the lowest temperature is. As far as the actual process of determining what that is, I think there is some guidance in NFPA 25. I'm not an expert on how to determine what the freeze point is, but it would be up to you and the building owner to figure out, and the AHJ as well, to figure out what the freeze point would be. For our test reports, if you were to send us a sample, we would provide you an estimated freeze point, and then you would have to go one step further and just verify that that is acceptable for your system and environment that you're in.
Thanks for that. Robert's asking, can Dyne test to determine if it's a listed solution?
Yes, we can. So I kind of went over that a little bit. We have worked with the manufacturers of the listed products. So we're under NDA for as far as the additives that are in there, but we can verify that your solution has those additives in there and verify that it is a listed product. So you won't get a full chemical composition report. You'll get, is it a listed product? Yes or no, and then we'll tell you what that product is, just to maintain the confidentiality with the manufacturers. But yeah, we can determine. So if you're not sure, maybe it was, a different contractor had that building at one point, and you're not sure if it was refilled with a listed product, we can certainly verify that. Or if you think it could be contaminated, we can also verify that as well.
Is that something you indicate on your sample return form when you send us the sample?
Yes. So I think both with our online form as well as the paper form, there is a checkbox on there to add the listed verification test. It is an extra charge. So if you just send us a sample and you don't indicate that you want that, you will just simply we'll simply verify if it's a glycerin or propylene glycol legacy solution. Those are still by far the most common solutions out there. So we'll verify that, provide you a percent concentration as well as an estimated freeze point. And if you do the listed product verification, we would do that additional chemical composition test. And if it's determined to be one of those types, we will tell you that, and then we'll indicate whether the ranges are within the specific gravity and density ranges, as well as give you the freeze point. So again, with the freeze point, like I mentioned, it's kind of a 100% concentration or not. So it will say, whatever the listed freeze point is for those listed products, it will say that on the report, or less than that if it's less than 100% concentration.
Okay, thanks for that. Fernando asks, the new listed solutions are still a propylene glycol or glycerin. They are just listed and pre-mixed, right?
Yeah, they are. I believe they're mostly glycerin or propylene glycol based, but then they just have additives in there. So they have additives to help keep the antifreeze in solution, as well as some corrosion inhibitors. So it's just got additives in there, but it will change the specific gravity and refractive index enough so that you can't use your refractometer that's calibrated for glycerin, for example. So that's, again, just the trade-off with the listed products.
Looks like Robert chimed in on that with the glycerin with additives. Thanks, Robert. He's also asking, and there's a caveat, we don't do the work out in the field, we're just doing it in our laboratory. But can you drain a legacy system and fill it with the listed without worrying about contamination?
So at that point, I would refer to the manufacturer's guidance on refilling the system. NFPA has some guidance on refilling the system with antifreeze. I think it's in the annex. I think it's annex of the 534 section. And it kind of says that you don't typically have to drain the drops of a system, but if you have larger drops or drops where you have known concentration issues, you might want to consider draining those drops before refilling with a listed product. Again, it's not clear, it's just guidance in the annex, and I would also speak to the manufacturer of the listed products directly, and they could probably give you additional guidance as well.
I think the answer would probably be the same to talk to the manufacturer, but maybe you can chime in on all new listed solutions safe with CPVC or PCV, or only glycerin-based listed solutions.
I would refer you to the product data sheet. I'm not an expert on the compatibility of the listed products with the specific sprinkler type.
I'll point you in that direction. And what if multiple test points are not available? Dan asked.
I mean, the guidance is from an FCA 25 with those test points. You could propose to your AHJ, if you're only able to get one test point, and you could propose that to your AHJ, and they could accept that. I'm just providing the guidance from an FCA 25, but an AHJ would have the final call on that.
Brad's asking if we sell or recommend a certain field testing equipment. We do not sell or manufacture any types of equipment, actually, as far as field testing goes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't think we don't sell any equipment for that. There are specific like refractometers that are calibrated. With the listed solutions, if you're planning to do that in the field, you would just want a refractometer or hydrometer that just gives you the straight value, and then you could check that value against the product data sheet. As I've mentioned a few times, you can't use the ones that are calibrated for glycerin. The values are slightly different with those listed products, and it's not going to spit out an appropriate result for you.
Okay. Don't know if we have any failure rates, but one's asking about failure rates on the new listed solutions.
I don't have those off the top of my head. There are, I will say let's go to common reasons for failure. So one of the common reasons we get for listed products failing is they're just outside of the ranges. Those ranges are pretty tight for specific gravity and refractive index. So it is fairly easy to contaminate or dilute those samples outside of the range. And so from a laboratory perspective, we need to fail those. But if you know it's a listed product, you could also bring that to your AHJ for further consideration. It's just different. With legacy solutions, like you could have some dilution and it would still be okay as long as it was at the appropriate freeze point for your area. But with the listed products, it's just a much tighter range. So we do see higher failure rates for that. But like I said, largely are still getting legacy solutions in for testing. That is by far still the majority of antifreeze solutions out in the field.
There's a couple mentions of NFPA, and there's a map about where you live, like a map in NFPA 13, I believe. That might have some location guidance as far as that goes.
Yeah.
Let's see, I'm trying to catch up with you here. The temperature rating we are considering adequate is based on the product we are using, question mark.
So I'm not sure I totally understand the question. The listed products do have a specific freeze point. So if your needs exceed that, then you would need to use other means of freeze protection, whether that's a dry system or heat tracing, or some other means of freeze protection. The listed products don't go as may not go as cold as you need them to. I know in Minnesota here, I don't believe we have many antifreeze systems just because it gets too cold for the antifreeze, and most of the systems here are using our dry systems to avoid that because it just gets too cold.
And who calibrates the refractometers? Is it the antifreeze manufacturer?
If you buy a refractometer that's calibrated for a specific type of antifreeze, that would come from the refractometer manufacturer. They would do the calibrating there. I suppose an antifreeze manufacturer may also sell equipment, and at that point they would be responsible for calibrating. That's not something we currently do. We would just be able to do the actual testing for you in the laboratory versus in the field. But it's a good point, though. You'd probably want to make sure that your equipment is calibrated if you're doing it out in the field, just to make sure you're getting an accurate test result.
Okay, I'm not sure I've seen any more technical questions coming in. If anybody has any last minute questions, go ahead and throw them out in the chat. There's been questions on pricing. I can get back to you guys on the pricing tiers for pricing of all the different samples and get you a whole list of all of our services if that would be helpful. I do want to mention again that we have another webinar coming up in October on corrosion and NIC testing. I believe Grant Lobdell is going to be giving that one scheduled for Wednesday, October 14th. There will be a link to sign up for that in the follow-up communication from this one. So feel free to sign up for that and join us for that next one. There's a question coming in. Is there an expiration on antifreeze solution?
That is a good question. I don't know if I know for legacy solutions, not that I'm aware of, if they're still passing the specifications, they would still be appropriate. I would imagine the same would be true for listed solutions. If they're still meeting the specific gravity and refractive index ranges, as well as the percent concentration requirements, I would imagine those would be appropriate. The manufacturer might provide an expiration date, but there's not like a general one or one that's just standard in NFPA 25 or anything. So I would check with the manufacturer, but if it's still measuring within concentration and within the allowable range, then it would probably still be acceptable for use. Any other questions on the testing or about the webinar? I see some more coming in.
The October webinar, is it also nice at CE? We do give you a certificate for all the webinars. We are a partner in training. They don't pre-approve our content and like put a stamp of approval of it, but we do send you that certificate so you can turn that in when you are recertifying. And if you have any feedback on something that works and doesn't work, and when you get those, let me know and I will have more information on that. Can you explain what a refractometer is and how it works?
Sure. So a refractometer is it measures refractive index, which is a measure of how the light is refracting in the sample. I know that doesn't sound very very clear, but it's a measurement and it has to do with how the light refracts within the sample. And so in our laboratory, we have a benchtop unit that measures out to the fourth digits. And so the field refractive index refractometer may not be quite as accurate, but it's a similar concept and it's more of a handheld unit. And you just need a small sample of the solution, and you put it on the reading area and measure how well the light refracts, and that will give you a value. And so it's usually, I don't know if that chart in here, this chart here has specific gravity, but refractive index is similar, you know, usually like 1.35 something. That's just a rough estimate of refractive index value. But on a data sheet, it would give you a range. And so you would just be looking to see, is that number within the range for the listed products? If you had a chart that had a refractive index, it would be a similar concept. But this chart here in the annex of an FPA 25 is specific gravity, which is very similar to density. So you may see on our reports, we do say density, but it's very similar to specific gravity. Same thing, you'd be looking at the value and is it within the range of those two numbers, and match it up to the percent volume and freeze point.
Okay, thanks for that question. Someone else is sharing a type of refractometer they use in the field. That's a self-calibrating one. So thanks for sharing that information with the others. I don't know if I see any other specific testing questions coming through. Does it need to be calibrated for antifreeze?
For the refractometer,
That's what I'm guessing they meant.
yeah, so you could have a refractometer that just gives you a value, and it should come, depending on where you get it from, it should come calibrated. And like I said, there are some that are calibrated to a specific type of antifreeze. So instead of giving you a straight refractive index value, it already does kind of the calculation itself and does give you the percent concentration as well as the freeze point. But there are also like handheld ones that gives you the exact refractive index values, which you would then compare to the product date sheet and make sure it's within the range.
All right, thanks for that. David's asking if we can share the listed temperatures per area. We will send a follow-up email with the PowerPoint slides. I'll see if we can find that information and share that along with the PowerPoint for you guys and help put that in your hands and be a sharing of knowledge base that we like to be for all the people that work with us and our customers. So yeah, we can look for that.
Yeah, I usually have the chart in here. I didn't include it in this presentation, but there is a chart. It's like a map of the United States, and it kind of the temperature ranges on it. I think it's in the annex of NFPA, but yeah, we can certainly reference that and include it in the follow-up email.
Sounds good. Anybody else have any last minute questions? And somebody's thanking us for doing the webinars. Well, thank you guys for being here. I appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day to learn about the testing, and a lot of the stuff you guys are out in the field, so you already know, but good reminders and good place to collaborate and answer questions kind of as a group here. Again, I'll mention that we're going to be sending a survey and appreciate your feedback. So any other webinar type topics you'd like to see or you're interested in, please let us know. And our next webinar once more is scheduled on Wednesday, October 14th, corrosion and MIC lab testing and standards. Again, there'll be a link to register in my follow-up email. As always, watch the Dyne website or LinkedIn or Facebook pages or a monthly newsletter for more info. And unless Alyssa has any final comments?
Yeah, if you guys have any questions that we didn't get answered in this webinar, feel free to email me directly or our lab email, dyne.nfpaglobal.com, and we can certainly get all your questions answered.
All right, we'll put those email addresses also in the follow-up communication. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.